Well, since we've been in stories, that I'm going to talk about the fox and the chicken coop. Does anybody know about the fox and the chicken coop? Huh? Elena? No. What happens if you put a fox in charge of the you know what a chicken coop is?
Yeah.
Where they keep chickens? Yeah. What happens if you put a fox in charge of the chicken coop?
The fox will eat them.
Okay. So that's the title of this talk, and it's really a talk about how to control the mind, and the difficulty is that we're trying to control the mind with the mind. So sometimes that trying to control the mind with the mind is like trying to let the fox look after the chickens in the chicken coop. So this is I came up with this title with that idea in mind. Then I actually read the Aesop's fable, and it's quite different. So almost all of these stories that we find, even in the Indian tradition, the Holy Man and the Scorpion, we'll find the same thing in the Aesop's fables, because these fables, they went in all different traditions and cultures in different countries and everything. So I'm going to start by reading the actual Aesop's fable, which gives a completely different message, but which turned out to be very good for this topic, because when we use that expression, it's like the fox in the chicken coop. Generally, we mean that we're putting someone or something in charge of something that is going to do the exact opposite. Rather than protect the chicken, it'll eat the chickens, right? But night after night, a big red fox broke into a farmer's chicken coop and stole his prized chickens. "I'll catch that fox," said the angry farmer. "He won't live another day."
It's so funny.
Is that funny?
Yeah.
Okay. He built a trap inside the chicken coop. It was a large net attached to a frame. He attached a hidden wire to make the net fall over the fox when he stepped on it. The chickens were quite happy to see this strange-looking trap, and they stayed far away from it. That evening, when the sun was setting, the fox came creeping toward the chicken coop. He very quietly dug his way under the fence and into the coop. As he started toward the hen house, he tripped on the wire. The frame and net came crashing down on him, pinning him to the ground. The noise awakened the chickens. They ran out to see what happened. There was the big red fox tangled under the net, trying to get loose. "Help, help," cried the fox. "Help me get out of here." "Are you kidding?" shouted a rooster. "You will pay with your life when the farmer gets his hands on you." "Oh no, please, don't let the farmer catch me. I'll do anything you say." The rooster laughed. "Of course you'll do anything to save your life, now that you've been caught." All the chickens agreed and began making fun of the fox. However, one of the mother hens stepped forward. "Just a minute. I have a question. Mr. Fox, you said you would do anything to save your life." "Yes, anything you ask," answered the fox. "Well," she replied, "if you will do anything to save your life, will you do anything to save our lives also?" "Of course I will," said the fox. "Very well," said the hen. "If we set you free from this trap, will you remain here in this chicken coop and protect us from any other foxes that try to get in?" The fox was surprised at such a question, but his life was at stake, so he quickly shouted, "Oh yes, I will. I will stay in here for the rest of my life and protect you." The chickens were very happy to hear his reply, but they were not sure they could trust him. After all, foxes are known to be very foxy. However, after much discussion, they decided to set him free. They pecked away at the netting until it fell apart. The fox hopped out. To everyone's surprise, he kept his promise and remained in the coop as their protector. When the farmer came the next day, he could not believe his eyes. There was the fox playing with the chickens and protecting them from all outsiders. Never before had anyone seen such a sight. It wasn't long before everyone in the nearby town heard about it and came to see the fox in the chicken coop. How could this be, they asked. The farmer could not explain. He could not understand how this chicken-eating fox could change his ways so quickly. Only the chickens, you and I, know the answer. When he got caught and trapped inside, he changed his ways to save his hide. So it's very different from what we normally think of when we talk about the fox and the chicken coop that way. But both stories are perfectly applicable to the mind, because this untrained mind, this lower mind, this undisciplined mind, will be like the fox that eats all the chickens. And the mind that's mature and controlled and trained and everything will be like the fox that protects the mind. So this is the basic theme that I want to go through. So before we decide, do we want to trust the fox? Do we want to trust the mind to look after the mind? I wanted to look a little bit into this question about what is the mind, because we don't really know, we use this term, we talk about the mind. We only know what we assume is rising to the surface of the mind. We know ideas, we know thoughts, we know memories, perception, all of the things that become part of our conscious life, but we don't know the mind. We assume that the mind is the storehouse for old ideas and memories and everything, because it has to come up from someplace. It'll come up to the surface of the mind, but we only know the surface of the mind in exactly the same way that we only know the surface of external things. We really don't know anything other than appearance. This phenomenal world, the same thing, we have an internal phenomenal world, and what underlies that, what is the real nature of the mind, we don't know. Swamiji has one lecture where he says, underlying the external surface reality that we see is something that we call X. What we call matter is a metaphysical presupposition. We don't know what it is. We figure there has to be ground. If there's an appearance, there has to be ground. If there's surface, there has to be something beneath it, upholding it. So we call it X. He said, beneath the surface mind, where we have our conscious life, our thoughts, our perceptions, everything, is something which we call Y. He says X and Y are both Brahman, ultimately. They're the highest reality. Anyhow, that's a little bit beside the point, but what we find is that many of these ideas that we take for granted, we all assume we have a mind. If we analyze it and try to think, have we ever experienced the mind? Have we ever perceived it? Is it anything tangible? Then we realize that we don't know very much about it, that everything is a presupposition. We know tendencies, we know a little bit how associations work and all of that, but what is the reality of this thing that we call mind, we really don't know. And there are some traditions, especially some Zen Buddhist traditions, that take this to a very extreme level. They'll have a doctrine called no mind, that the only thing that really exists is a stream of thoughts, a stream of conscious experiences with nothing underlying it, because we don't see it. If we don't experience it, we don't know it exists, so they'll say that then why have this supposition that there is such a thing at all? So they have these schools, this no-mind school. Even in Vedanta, if there are no thoughts, there's no mind. At least no functioning mind. So we have this term called manonasha. Manonasha means destruction of the mind. Now, when we enter into some higher state, the state of samadhi, go into this completely merging, when the mind becomes still, there are no vrittis or anything, they call that manonasha, destruction of the mind. But we know it's not really destruction of the mind. If it were destruction of the mind, then somebody who has extreme brain damage or something like that will go into samadhi. We know it doesn't mean that exactly. But the point is, if it's not functioning, then it really has no existence. For the mind to be existing means that there has to be something on the surface. There has to be some flow of thought or something like that. Otherwise, it's the same as if the mind that's not functioning is the mind that's not existing. So they use that term, manonasya, destruction of the mind. So we find that in Vedanta, we'll have two different models, we can say, two different ways of looking at this. One is really that the mind that becomes very silent, the mind that's free from any thought or anything, is one with Brahman. So that means it's like a wave. What we call mind is simply this is ocean of consciousness that breaks into a certain wave. All of us are waves on that same ocean. When the wave becomes, when it merges back into the ocean, that's the same as the mind emerging in Brahman, then we see that there's no distinction. So with this model we can understand what Thakur meant when he said this pure mind and pure buddhi are one and the same. Pure buddhi and Atman are one and the same. And we merge the mind into the intellect, we merge the intellect into the Atman, so they're one and the same that way. So if we want to experience that ultimate reality, we make the mind silent. Now the mind hasn't destroyed itself or anything. It's just regained its real nature as pure consciousness. So even nirvikalpa samadhi has to be experienced through the mind. Right? We've no way of experiencing anything unless it's through the mind. But it's that mind that's silent. So really what we want is a quiet mind. We don't want a destroyed mind. We want a mind that's perfectly still, perfectly quiet, and then we have the experience of this higher reality. Now, this is one model, and I like this concept of model because otherwise we end up with conflicting philosophies. Because we have this other way of looking at it where the mind is an instrument. It belongs to nature, prakriti. And consciousness is something that gets reflected or animates it, just like a light bulb, and electricity will turn it on. We have the illustration of the sun reflected in different containers. It's actually an example used in Advaita Vedanta, but it's a dualistic type of model. And Thakur says that this is, he uses the term Puranic. That it belongs to the Puranas, that means it's dualistic or devotional, something like that. This doctrine explains the body-mind complex is like a cup filled with water, and the sun gets reflected in it, so we see the reflected sun on the surface of the water. So if there are a dozen cups like that, there'll be a dozen suns reflected in it. But if there are a dozen, it's not that each one gets 1/12. Each one has the full sun. So, but the source of it is the sun. Now, modern science is very busy trying to explain how this reflected sun, we see the sun on the surface of the water, how we can explain the existence of that sun by examining the nature of the cup and the water in it. This is a materialistic type of explanation. How we explain the existence of consciousness by analyzing DNA and chemical combinations and all of that. Vedanta will say this is the wrong approach. That you won't find the source of consciousness anywhere other than in that sun. That means in Brahman. That God is the real source of consciousness. But when it gets reflected, it appears to be resting on the surface of the body-mind. It has some apparent combination. So then we have body, mind, and consciousness. All of these three things come together. Now, is this a contradiction of the other theory? No. It's simply, it's kind of a working hypothesis. It's a very nice way of understanding how the mind can be seen as an instrument, and how we can understand that reflected sun will not reflect very well if the water is muddy. So if the mind is filled with other things, we won't see that reflection very clearly. If the water is choppy, broken into waves, then the sun will also look choppy. That reflection, if we want to see the true reflection of the sun in the mind or in the heart, then again we have to make it quiet. So the end result is the same. We have two different models, that's all. Two different ways of looking at it. Now we get into more trouble and more difficulty. First of all, so we don't understand much about mind. We understand much less about the brain and mind, how these two things work together. And I defy anyone to explain how changes in something which is obviously just physical, though living, some physical made of different cells and everything, how there can be a relationship between that and mind, which is completely just thought. There's no spatial location or anything like that. But we know that there's some one-to-one correspondence, right, between brain and mind. And yet, we don't understand the cause and effect of it. And very often we confuse the two. This idea of cause and effect, when two things happen simultaneously or in conjunction with each other, we always have two different ways of understanding the relationship between cause and effect. One common example is that we see, if you live in a farm, you'll see that as soon as the sun comes up, the rooster will crow. Right. Now, as we see this day after day, we can come to two conclusions. One is that as soon as the sun comes up, the rooster will crow. The other is, as soon as the rooster crows, the sun will come up. Right. So we don't know. So we can confuse these two things, cause and effect. The materialistic interpretation will be that changes in the brain will result in changes in our way of thinking. And, they've done all of these studies, especially with the Buddhist monks in meditation. They've done a lot of, scientific studies, and they can locate areas of the brain that seem to function at the time of meditation, if they can go into a very deep type of meditation. And they found that many of these Buddhist monks who spend years and years in meditation, that one area of the brain will be more highly developed. So for some of them, they'll come to the conclusion that if we happen to have a very highly developed portion of their brain, we'll be good meditators. Now, Vedanta will give the opposite explanation. We'll say they spent their whole life in meditation, so naturally, just as if we spend our whole life in exercise, then muscles will grow. So we'll take it that way, that the operative function is the sincerity of the monks, is their dedication, is their control of the mind, that this is the operative thing, not the brain. Brain is a lump of matter. How can that be the cause of anything? At the same time, we know if somebody gets a brain injury, it affects, motor things and mental things and all of that. So they work hand in hand, both ways. But how the one thing affects the other is a very mysterious thing. Right? I don't think the scientists have any clue about things like that. I remember, this Sanjay Gupta. Yeah, this is CNN medical analyst or something, who's also a neurosurgeon. He said that they've discovered some hormone which they think is responsible for the ability to love people. Now, to me, it's ridiculous. we develop this capacity to love because of the purity of heart, because of our upbringing, all sorts of different things, which can stimulate a hormone, if there is one. It's not that the hormone is causing us to love people. It's got to be the other way around. But Could be that we find this hormone, we can inject it in someone, and it'll make them a little more loving. We don't know. So these things do work a little bit mutually, back and forth that way. But what we do know is that the mind, if there is such a thing, is very difficult to control. Swamiji compares it to a monkey who gets drunk, who gets stung by a scorpion, who gets possessed by a ghost. He says the mind is like that, and we're trying to control this mind. Now, the theme of this talk this morning is that we're trying to control this mind with the mind itself. We have no other option. What else do we use to control that mind? And is it going to be the fox that eats the chickens, or is it going to be the fox that protects the chickens? So this is really what we're trying to do, because the ordinary mind is not very trustworthy, and we don't know why the thoughts that come into the mind, and we don't know why we react to it. The mind somehow seems to separate itself into two minds. The one that's looking after it, the one that's watching it, the one that's making decisions, and the one that's just the receptacle for all sorts of things. We don't know where these ideas come from, especially when we first sit for meditation. Sometimes we'll find these things coming in, old memories that we thought we'd forgotten, old slights that people made, and we'll be shocked. Where did these things come from? Because we were happy to let them just sit at the bottom of the mind before. Or dreams. Sometimes we'll have a dream, we'll wake up in the morning and say, where did that come from? Such strange things and emotions and all nightmares and everything. We have no idea why and when it happened. We may trace it back to some incident, or maybe some spicy food that we ate, or some movie that we watched. Other times we just don't know why these things happen that way. So in spiritual life, we're trying to do many things. We're trying to control the mind. We're also trying to purify it so that these things don't keep coming up and disturbing us. So sometimes they compare it to trying to clean out an inkwell. In the kids today will have no idea what I'm talking about. In the old days, you had a desk, and it had a little place where you put the ink jar in, and you would dip your pen into it, and you would write that way. And the only way you could clean this inkwell out was by pouring water in, and then now the first time you pour water in, it's going to be very, very dark and inky, and then you put the water out, and you keep pouring. Each time you put fresh water in, it becomes a little bit clearer. So in meditation, if these things come up, we shouldn't bother about it. We should think, good, now I can get rid of it. So this is part of that process of purifying the mind. Holy Mother says that we have a whole lifetime of experiences, that it's like a ball of yarn that's been tied. If we want to get to the bottom of it, we have to undo the whole thing again. So a lot of the things that we experienced before have to come back to the conscious mind again, and then we can get rid of these things and be free from them. So this is the positive side of the situation and the negative side of the situation are the same. That the mind can separate itself. The mind can be the one that looks after the mind. However we understand it, a higher mind or lower mind, that part of the mind that is discriminative mind, and that part of the mind which is intuitive, all different ways that we can put it, but we find that this probably is what separates human beings from other species, that we have this ability to make decisions, freely make decisions, although to a great extent our decision making is determined by the makeup of the mind itself, and by whatever standards we have, whatever propensities we have, all of this. So there's a little bit of psychological determination, but still we feel that we have some freedom. If we make a decision, then we're responsible for it. We can't simply say, my mind made me do it, or anything like that. So there was a great French philosopher named Sartre. he said that man is condemned to be free. It's just an expression. So that means we have to accept responsibility for that. So the mind itself has the power to monitor the mind and to separate itself, to adjust it, to make corrections, to make changes, to remold, to reform itself somehow. This is within our power, but it's very slow. And until we realize it's within our power, we just keep doing the same things over and over again. So spiritual life, a big part of spiritual life, is making a decision that we want to take control. And we do it through behavioral modification. It's not just through changing our way of thinking, it's through changing our way of action, which will lead to changing our way of thinking. So we have this situation where we are telling the fox, okay, we're gonna put you in charge, but we're gonna watch you first. We're gonna see if you're the good fox or the bad fox, because the mind sometimes is so contrary that it'll do the exact opposite of what we want it to do, and we won't know why it does it. There's an interesting verse. This is supposed to be the words of Duryodhana, and he says, Janami dharmam nachame pravritti. I know dharma, I know what I should do, I know the right thing to do, but I don't know how to do it. I don't do it. Pravritti. Then he says, Janami adharmam nachame nivritti. I know what I shouldn't do, but I can't keep myself from doing it. Then it says, Kenapi devena hridistitena yatha niyuktos sme tata karomi. So I know what virtue is, but I can't practice it. I know what vice is, but I can't refrain from it. It is as if some God were seated in my heart, and I act as I am compelled by Him to act. So we have this feeling, especially in the beginning of spiritual life, we see it with children to a large extent, that have no control over their temper, over their small children. They want something so badly that they'll have a temper tantrum, right? They'll throw things, they'll scream, they have to have something. We get a little bit older, and we learn that no, we can have it later, we can control ourselves a little bit, but still we have this feeling that we don't really have this type of control over the mind. I think I mentioned yesterday that Arjuna asked this question to Sri Krishna in Gita, that Atakena pariyuktoyam papam charati purushaha. So he says, why do we do things that we shouldn't do without even wanting to do it? And he says, Anicham api varsnaya baladi vinyoji. We don't want to do it, and we feel as if we're being forced to do it. We know that we shouldn't do it. Why do we do it? So he's basically saying, what is the crazy nature of the mind, so that even things that we know will be harmful for ourselves, that we do it. We know that we lose our temper, that we're going to regret it later. We do many things that we know that we'll regret, and we still do it. So Sri Krishna says that, look, this is the nature of the mind. The nature of the mind in an ordinary human being is filled with some combination of the gunas, but his rajas is there, and kama, krodha, these are this anger and hatred and jealousy, and all these passions are there. These passions are our enemies. These passions are the things that drag us around by the neck and make us do things we don't want to do. So we have to practice some type of self-control. So this idea of self-control becomes the operative factor here. And in Gita, again, very, very brilliant psychological teachings. It says that the mind that is under control is our best friend, and the mind that is not is our worst enemy, and almost like an external enemy, like somebody else that we have no control over what somebody else does to us. The mind is uncontrolled. It's like that. So he said, what do? We lift up the mind. We have to do it with our own self-effort. We have to be aware of all of these things. We have to watch the mind, And he says if we can do that, it can be our best friend, and if we can't, it'll be our worst enemy. So let one raise oneself. Here the self means the mind or the ego, by one's own self. Let him not lower himself. For the self, one's own mind, is one's best friend, and the same mind is one's worst enemy. And then he says that which one is the friend, the one that is conquered, Jitatma, the one that is controlled. We have what I call the myth of discrimination. There's this belief that we can logically analyze something, and through this power of discrimination decide what is the right thing to do and what is the wrong thing to do. The reason I call it a myth is that it's highly subjective and depends to a great extent on these hidden desires for things. I'll give you one example that I know personally from my own life. That when we discriminate about food, if we're not very hungry, and if we've had some food that we like, we've had it recently, we don't have a strong desire for it, somebody offers us something that we know gives us indigestion, that it raises our cholesterol, is not very good for us, then we use our sense of discrimination and say, no, that it's just a little momentary pleasure, I'll suffer later, that I won't take it. If we're very hungry, if we haven't had it for a long time, and we have some real desire for it, we use the same sense of discrimination, and we say, life is short. I should enjoy myself every once in a while. What is this? Too much obsession with the health of the body and everything, that I'm supposed to be unattached from the body. Same sense of discrimination, and we end up eating it and suffering later. So this immature mind, this mind that's filled with desires and everything, is not to be trusted, because the fox is very foxy, and this is what the mind does. It will tell us that we're using discrimination, that we're being very sensible, and this is the result of it. Yes?
Swamiji, so how will we ever take any confident decision about anything? I mean, and you're right, I understand what exactly you are saying, because as more and more I'm moving towards more spirituality and less intellectual. Intellect is always going to cut something in size and try to figure out things, right? But if we don't depend, I'm not saying depend, I mean the right word is if we don't even listen to that process of analyzing a situation and coming to a conclusion around it, then how will we ever come to we'll say that this is a proper decision we should take and move on. Smaller things, fine, like a food. But if in a corporate world, in your life situations, in your companionship, marriage, and anything, right? Either we learn from our mistakes or we don't. And we have to learn a different type of discrimination, and that is: are we discriminating or are we rationalizing? Because half of the time when we say discriminate, we're doing something that we really want to do, and we're giving some reason, we're rationalizing that way. Right. Now, Thakur talks about different types of people. The one he says is bodhoji, those who are bound to this world, that they'll opt for something which is enjoyable, and even though they suffer from it. So he gives the example of the camel. That there's a certain type of thorny bush, this acacia tree and everything, that is leaves are very, very tasty. The camel likes it very much. But every time it eats it, all its gums and everything start to bleed because of the thorns in it. But it likes it, so it continues to do it. Doesn't learn anything from it. Or he says like something called the hog plum. In Bengali, what is it? Anyhow, he says it's got a very big pit in it, and it's got a very little flesh, not much, and if you eat it, you get colic, you get sick from it, but it tastes good. So it's a choice. These things are all choices. Right. Are we willing to suffer later for something? We hope that we're intelligent people, we learn our lessons. So a lot of it is based on experience, that if we stick our finger in the fire often enough, then we'll learn not to do it, then we'll learn that type of discrimination. But not everyone does it. I remember reading about this professional golfer named John Daly. I don't know if anybody follows any of this stuff, but John Daly was a very good golfer, but he was extremely overweight and was a very heavy beer drinker. And he had a real problem with drinking and overeating and everything. And he went through all of this therapy, and he went through rehab and everything. And he lost some weight, and he stopped drinking completely. Then, after some time, he started again. So they asked him what happened. And he said, I realized that I was happier when I was a fat drunk than I am now. So then what can you do? Then we simply have to say that people are at different stages in spiritual life and in life in general, and sometimes this desire for something, better, isn't awakened yet, or he didn't see it through to the end. But one of the points I want to get to here is that a realization comes to us at some point that this life of self-control is a happier life. We have to have that realization. If life of control there's a beautiful verse. Again, the Gita is very helpful for all of this. There's a verse. It says, "Those who are able to withstand the pull of the senses and desire and all of that." It says that the yukta and sukhinara. So these are the people who are people of self-control, who have some feeling of connection with that ultimate reality, but they're happy people. So we have to convince the mind that we'll be happier if we can practice self-control, if we're not slaves to the whims of our desires and enjoyments and all of that. And we can't do that until we start to experience it a little bit. So this is one of the very key features of all of this, that it's not simply that the fox is just saving its life, but the fox is happier that way. This is what we have to try to convince ourselves of that. Now, how do we do it? How do we actually go about in a very practical way going towards Shreyas instead of Preyas? Because this is the choice that we have. Either we do something which is pleasant and easy and desirable and forget about the consequences, or we do something which ultimately will lead to a deeper sense of satisfaction and joy, even though it means that we have to practice self-control and we don't give way to all of our desires and all of our pleasures and things like that. There's a parable that we find in the Native American tradition. It says, an old Cherokee is teaching his grandson about life. Listen, this is a good parable. You like this one? He said, a fight is going on inside me. He told his grandson. It is a terrible fight, and it is between two wolves. One is evil. He has anger, envy, sorrow, regret, greed, arrogance, self-pity, guilt, resentment, inferiority, lies, false pride, superiority, and ego. The other is good. He is joy, peace, love, hope, serenity, humility, kindness, benevolence, empathy, generosity, truth, compassion, and faith. So two of them fighting each other. The same fight is going on inside you and inside every other person too. The grandson thought about it for a minute and then asked his grandfather, which wolf will win? The old Cherokee simply replied, the one that you feed. So this becomes the key. This is what I was saying, behavioral modification. That if we keep feeding the senses enjoyment, then we'll be like the camel. Then we'll say, okay, because the memory is funny. We remember the good taste, we forget the bleeding. So if we keep feeding that one, we keep going back and have the same enjoyments and the same suffering and the same feeling of, because it leads to a very poor self-image also. If we don't have that feeling of self-control and self-respect and everything. So we keep feeding that becomes stronger. That's the one that wins. If we decide that we want to feed the other one, that means that we keep holy company, It means that we read spiritual books, that we do meditation, spiritual practice, all of these things, that we find teaching from Thakur, Holy Mother. Then we're feeding the good wolf, and the other one will eventually just slink off and die someplace. We won't have to worry about it. So this is that very practical aspect of this, that we have to learn how to make the mind our friend, to feed the good wolf, so that we can trust it, because Ramakrishna says that this unripe mind in the beginning is not to be trusted, but when this mind becomes ripe, then the mind itself becomes the guru, then it becomes the antaryaman, then it will only tell us what's good for us. In the beginning, it'll pretend. In the beginning, it'll pose as the good fox. It'll make us think that I'm giving you all the best advice and everything, when it's just feeding its own desire that way. So, one thing is, knowledge is power. As soon as we understand the nature of the mind, and if we find that the mind can't be trusted, then what do? We have role models. Then we see this is the value of examining the lives of these great saints. We say, what would Holy Mother, how would she react in this way? What does Thakur say about that? And then we go to, this becomes our pramana. So again, Sri Krishna says, because Arjuna also says it, he says, let the great teachings be the standard by which you live in this world. We don't trust the mind and make decisions, and then we have these shining examples, the gold standard. There's a very nice idea in Christianity. They say, what would Jesus do? It's a nice idea. Not that we can have such a high standard, but at least we know that we're trying to realize a type of higher ideal. So this is the first thing. You have to go. I know. Okay. That just the awareness. This strength is some type of power. Then the other thing is, we need to be very bold. Swami emphasizes this idea of strength, that we have to, when we know what is the right thing to do, we have to have the strength to follow through, because the mind can very often, as I say, rationalize, and we can convince ourselves that, oh, that's the right thing to do, I'll do it next time. But we need that strength. We have to be very heroic. Now you want to read a couple of nice quotes from Swamiji. He alone can be religious who dares say, as the mighty Buddha once said under the bo tree, when the temptation came to him to give up his search after truth, to go back to the world and live the old life of fraud, calling things by wrong names, telling lies to oneself and to everybody, he, the giant, conquered it and said, death is better than a vegetating ignorant life. Is it better to die on the battlefield than to live a life of defeat? Yeah, and this is what I was saying before, that we have to convince ourselves that we'll be happier also. So he said, the mind uncontrolled and unguided will drag us down forever, rend us, kill us, and the mind controlled and guided will save us, free us. So it must be controlled, and psychology, Raja Yoga, teaches us how to do it. So we have the marriage of these two very important concepts, that this self-control of the mind and happiness. It's not the same type of happiness that we get through running around and excitement and all of that. A very quiet type of deep contentment that we get when we feel that the mind is under our control. If the mind is not under our control, then we've lost our freedom. Then we're being dragged around like that. So this mind becomes a very pure mind. We develop something called sattvic happiness. The sattvic happiness, the Gita says in the beginning it tastes like poison because we don't have a taste for it. At the end it tastes like nectar. And then we have this beautiful phrase, this Atma Buddhi Prasadajam, that it's born of this transparency of the mind and the senses and everything, and this understanding of our real nature, that I am that self. So all of these are the different ways that we can develop the type of mind that we can trust, the type of mind that will save us. If we can do that, then the mind itself will be our own teacher, our own guru. That then our instincts will be dead on. And we see this with these great souls. They don't have to think about things too much. That whatever they do turns out to be right. Thakur says that like an expert dancer, they never take a false step. They never miss a beat. It becomes second nature to them. So when we reach that state, it doesn't mean that necessarily that we're God realized, but we can have some confidence in our sense of discrimination, and we can feel that we have that ability to monitor ourselves. It's not that we won't have desires that come up, tendencies to get angry and all of that, but we'll be able to check it. And we'll be able to say, no, I know from past experience that this isn't helpful for me in the long run, that I'm happier if I have this feeling of control and that I don't have to give way to all of these things. So this is the technique, really. From a very practical point of view, we feed the good wolf. That means we have to really have some spiritual practice. We have to try to keep holy company. I always recommend reading the Gospel of Ramakrishna. That if we read that, Gospel of Holy Mother, we examine the lives of these great souls, then they set the standard for us. And we follow that until we reach that time where it becomes second nature, and the mind will tell us what to do. So then it'll be like this good fox. The fox, because the fox knows all the tricks of the mind. Fox knows how to get into the chicken coop, knows all of that. So the fox is the best one to protect the chicken coop also. So that's the fox and the chicken coop.
Right, it's time for any questions.
Sure. There's always time.
Will you please tell us about some guards? Like some days you read Kathamrita and
Yes.
like, well, I'm feeling better. The next day you go 3 steps down. And in daily life, like say, get into fights and all these things. And can you tell us a few guards? Like when
There are two things. One is that it's the nature of the mind to have ups and downs, for no external reason. There's no rhyme or reason to it all of the time. It's like the tides. So there'll be a high tide. Sometimes there'll be a low tide. We can say it because of the phase of the moon. So that the mind is a very tricky thing. We don't know why. Second thing is that circumstances affect the mind so much, and this is why in the old days, those who wanted to lead a really spiritual life, they withdrew themselves from society. They weren't susceptible to all of the ups and downs. They didn't have family life problems, job problems, all of that. They gave themselves an environment where they were free from that. People who live in the world don't have that luxury. So we have to expect that there will be times when circumstances will pull the mind down a little bit, and other times when, for no apparent reason, we wake up one morning and we feel everything seems okay. We wake up another morning and everything is a problem. If we understand it's the nature of the mind, that we just have to wait it out, the mind will come back up again. So that way we don't pay too much attention to it. And we try to develop this feeling of being the witness of the mind, to disidentify with the mind. These are simply vrittis that come into the mind. Now there's this anger vritti, now there's this envy vritti, now there's a little depression vritti. I'm watching it, I'm unaffected by it, I know that it's a temporary thing. If we take that attitude, then this wave of the mind will become less, and it won't last as long. It's a very helpful way of approaching it also.
And sometimes this funny ego that you think, okay, now I'm understanding, it should not be challenged. Now somebody comes and walks at you, well, you're trying to be like Ramakrishna?
Yes.
It tells me that, so I don't know how to get rid of that. Like, see, I should not be angry when somebody mocks me saying that, oh, you're trying to preach something and you're not really that. How to guard against that?
Yeah, this Thakur calls this ego a rascal. Huh? He says a takshala. He says, let the rascal remain, dashhai. So let it remain as a servant of God. So we utilize this sense of ego, but we try to keep this ego in a relationship with God, because as the ego comes back, and you're right, all it does, it hides itself. We never really get rid of this ego. As soon as somebody says something, then it comes back. But we have to try to lessen the force of it. We're human beings. We will always be susceptible to these things. If we have a higher ideal and a deeper purpose in life, we won't be affected as much as other people, or as much as we used to. If we tell ourselves that, first of all, why do we care so much what other people say? If we understand that we don't have to participate in these things. You can say all sorts of nasty things to me. I won't get insulted unless I agree to get insulted, unless I participate in it. I can just listen and say, okay. Or I can say, you're right. You can say that, Swami, that was such a ridiculous talk you gave. You can say, yeah, you're right. Yeah, it wasn't. We see people like that. You can't insult them. You look funny. Yeah, I know. I'm not a very good-looking person. I don't sing very well. I know all these things. I don't mind. It's okay. So this pride, of course, is one of the big problems in life. So we have to develop a little humility. Sometimes we do it by comparing ourselves with others and saying, no matter how good we are, there's people who are so much better. Whatever it is, it's some skill, it's some talent, it's job related, whatever it is. That way we can develop a little bit of humility and just accept that other people are like that. That's like the scorpion. Huh? We say, yeah, this person is like that. They have some motive, some reason, they get some joy out of insulting me, let them enjoy it. Of course, family members, it's too close. We can't do it that much. And sometimes we try to, if there are situations, rather than just worry about how we react to it and accept it, sometimes we try to fix things also. Sometimes somebody insults us, we say, oh, did I do something to insult you? And they'll say, oh, you don't know. And then you say, oh, I didn't realize, I'm sorry. So sometimes we can actually, mend a bad situation also. But there are no tricks. There's no great secrets to these things. Everything takes a little bit of hard work, and a little bit of self-analysis, and a big dose of humility. Humility, sincerity, all of these things, they make up for all sorts of defects that we have.
There's a story, I think, I don't know, you told us or something, that Buddha went to...
Yes.
I think
someone came and started insulting him, and then he said, tell me, if somebody wants to give you a gift and you don't accept it, what happens is it remains with the giver. And he said, yes, you've been saying all of these things, giving me all of these insults, I'm not accepting them. They'll simply remain with you that way. Yeah.
I have one more if you have any
time
actually.
Okay.
So with the kids, like say I have two young kids, Rick and Rishi, sitting there. So when they are younger, like say 3rd grade, 4th grade, they become attached to spirituality, I would say. And then over a period of time go to middle school and maybe peer pressure and all that. They try to show that they don't care. And I don't know how much you should try to bring them to it or just offer it and see how much they want to take, or what would be a better way of handling
the more they have contact with people who lead a good spiritual life, that means you at home also, the more they have friends here like that, the more comfortable they'll be with it. The more their friends are all outside, they have no interest in these things, the pull will come from that way. So again, it's a question of feeding. Huh? Yes. So it's very important for them to have these very positive role models. Most important role model for kids is parents. And if the kids really see that parents are leading a spiritual life, they have a spiritual practice, and they love and respect their parents, that'll leave a very deep samskar. Maybe you won't see it until they grow older later. There may be periods when, you know, they're embarrassed or they want to be with their friends and things like that, but that'll leave a very deep impression. So parents have a great role to play in that. And the more you bring them here and they have the company of all the devotees here, other kids who are also interested in this, that'll be very important, very helpful. But there will be phases, of course, when, you know, they're not interested. Everyone goes through these phases and things.
And what is the meaning of spiritual things? They come here, go to the mandir, temple, or some good people, some good discussion. What is the meaning of spiritual things?
Not so much just, you know, going to some ritualistic things like that. If they can hear some of these high ideas, all these kids, all these nice stories that they were telling and everything, they leave an impression. They'll remember these ideas. Be compassionate, be loving, practice self-control, practice charity, all of these things. When they hear these things at a young age, they'll remember these things. These are more important. It doesn't have to be couched in Hindu terms, or it doesn't have to be, you know, temple ritual, lighting incense. But respect for that is also important. They'll develop some respect for that. But if they see at home, for example, you have some home shrine, you do a little japa or meditation or something like that, they'll know that this is a time you can't make noise. Parents are sitting in prayer, and then you want the kids to join you in prayer. We've seen families like that, and kids really who grow up like that can be amazing, very mature and calm and quiet. Others, of course, they all have their own personality that they're born with, and, yeah. But these things are helpful. Yeah.
Actually, in my thing, I don't go to the temple, but I come here for good.
Yeah, temple is not necessary.
Yeah, this is my question. Spiritual things means go to the temple and just prayer and what is this candlestick, when
This is more.
Or I like these things.
Yeah.
This is which one I can choose.
Yeah.
I choose this one because I love this one.
Yeah.
And I never go to the temple.
Yeah.
Is it right or no? My decision.
No, that going to the temple or not going to the temple is a secondary thing. This is definitely important. If you go to a temple, there's no harm. But this is really the character building part of it more. The other, if they develop some nice, respectful attitude towards temple worship, there's no harm. But that shouldn't be the only thing. If they learn some chanting and things, it's some very traditional South Indian families. These kids can chant right and left from childhood. It's a nice thing. It's definitely a very positive thing. But this has a special value.
Yeah, actually, Ramakrishna is all Christian, Buddha, Muslim, everything he likes. That's why I teach my kids, don't separate everybody. He is Christian, he is dead.
Yes.
Only one thing is everybody is people or man, some you love them.
Yeah.
And don't do this. He is Christian. Oh, he goes to the church. No. That's why I don't go to the temple.
Yeah, this of course is one of the great teachings of Sri Ramakrishna. This very open and loving attitude towards all religious traditions and everything. Very, very important, of course, especially in such a multicultural, you know, country and environment as we have here, to have this love and respect for all traditions. Yeah, very important.
Because they said, why we are not going to church, why not temple?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.